Please join me in welcoming David DeLong, who will be speaking about revisiting Cranbrook, Eliel Saarinen, and the survival of tradition. Thank you again.
Well, my thanks to Craig for that very generous introduction, and my thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold evening. And of course, my thanks to the members of the museum and the many supporters who are here this evening. It is interesting to revisit Cranbrook. I feel more positively about it now than I did 29 years ago when I began my research. It really means more to me. I understand it, I think, in a better framework. And it's a remarkable survival. I don't think I appreciated that in the 1980s. Here we have a private arts and crafts community encompassing a grade school, preparatory schools for boys and girls, they are now joined, and an art school still offering degrees in architecture and design. It was founded and paid for by George and Ellen Booth. Their fortune derived from the Detroit News, and it was built on their estate in Bloomfield Hills. We see the Booths on the left, and on the right, their home, originally known as Cranbrook, which was designed by Albert Kahn and built from 1907 to 08. And it's elsewhere on their estate that Cranbrook went up, but at the hands of a quite different architect. In fact, Cranbrook is probably still best known for the work of Eliel Saarinen, who was born in 1873 and died in 1950. We're seeing distant views of buildings we will go into in greater detail. He conceived its master plan, he designed its most important buildings, and as president of the Art Academy, the first president and a president for many years, he shaped its curriculum, hired its faculty, and headed what was one of the country's leading schools of architecture, and it still is one of the leading places for graduate study. It's about his buildings that I'm going to concentrate my remarks this evening, and to do that we need to drop back and look at some of Saarinen's early history. When he came to this country in 1923, he was widely regarded as Finland's leading architect. He had been schooled in architecture in Helsinki, where he became an ardent supporter of the arts and crafts movement, believing in handcrafts, native materials, and simple forms. While in school, he also formed a partnership with two fellow students, Herman Geselius and Armas Lindgren. And what we see on the left is their first major design, dating from 1899. They had won the prestigious competition for the Finnish Pavilion at the Paris Exposition of 1900, and it illustrates how they began as practitioners of what came to be called national romanticism, a combination of medieval Finnish motifs with German Jugendstil thrown in together with work by American architect H.H. Richardson. Now, I found this very confusing when I was in Finland in the 1980s, and Craig and I both asked several Finnish historians, why Richardson when you're defining Finnish nationalism? Well, we got a very consistent answer, which has remained strong. That is, in Finland, Richardson, and we see his little library on the left, the Weinhardt Memorial Library. Richardson was highly regarded as someone who defined, at the beginning, a national style for America, and architects at the turn of the century in Finland, who were also seeking to define a national style after their newly won independence from Russia, found in Saarinen a model. Now, what we see as a connection is mainly one of massing and, to a certain degree, in later buildings, rock-faced masonry. The Finnish motif is that little tower-like element, which looks like the tower on the Wynne Library, but is actually an abstraction of a Finnish maypole, which is a very important day of celebration in Finland after their long winters. These components are more in evidence in the Pahola insurance building in Helsinki, about the same time, 1899 to 1902, richly decorated, detailed, heavy Teutonic forms, enhanced again by, here clearly stated, rock-faced masonry, very evocative of Richardson. Now, what we'll see this evening is that Saarinen was very adept at changing gears and changing inspirations. and he sometimes later rejected his own earlier work. He wrote of his early work in Finland. It was a series of pompous Richardsonian pseudo-romantic castles. And in the authorized text of his monograph, he was in charge of what was said and how it was illustrated. Albert Christianer said of this early phase of Saarinen's career that he had to work his way out of this confusion. Now, what might have been seen as confusion when the book was published in 1948 was not seen as confusion later, and even less so now. Well, that firm of young architects amassed enough capital by 1902 to build an extraordinarily luxurious setting for themselves, 3 connected houses with attached studios in the country outside Helsinki, a famous building. We see a distant view of the part in which Saarinen lived and a site plan on the right. Well, the pressures of long winters in their isolated setting led to some expected problems. There was a bit of wife swapping, and ultimately, and understandably, the partnership dissolved. But Saarinen emerges as the lead designer, as one by one his other partners found more fertile fields. And Saarinen continued to add to the estate. We'll see, if you go there, you'll see many later changes. And he returned there every summer after coming to this country until the outbreak of World War II. It's now a national monument. The same year they began Vitres, they won another major competition for the National Museum in Helsinki. And here, again, we see an example of national romanticism, national expression. But now the Richardsonian influence is beginning to wane, and medieval Finnish motifs are assuming greater presence. I didn't fully understand that until a more recent trip to Finland, when I was driving in the country and realized when I saw that medieval church in Inko on the right, that the gable motif was exactly what Saarinen was adapting for the National Museum. Now, I've not studied all these details all that greatly, but I'm convinced that one could dissect these buildings and find many interesting sources. They were very good at winning competitions, even with the partnership breaking up. And in 1904, Geselius and Saarinen won the competition for the Helsinki railway station. We all know the picture on the right, which was what was built. But that isn't what won the competition. What won the competition is a very close match to the National Museum. Even the massing is similar. And again, an example of this early period of nationalism. The prize money was rather good. And quite sensibly, Saarinen immediately embarked on a European tour to visit works by other leading early modern architects. And this resulted in a series of major revisions in 1906, so that what we see on the left was redesigned to be built as what we see on the right. Among the motifs one can see the great arched doorway with engaged statues holding lanterns draws very much from Joseph Maria Olbricht's Ernst Ludwig House, an art community in Darmstadt of 1899 to 1901. And the tower of the railway station seems influenced by Joseph Hoffmann's Palais Stokely in Brussels. That had been designed in 1904 and was only under construction when Saarinen visited Brussels, but he probably saw design drawings for the house. And both Olbricht and Hoffmann have been identified as major protagonists of the arts and crafts movement in Europe. So we had a reason for particularly studying their work. But then another shift. In his Villa Kirchner of 1915 to 18 in Helsinki, he produced one of several designs of the late teens that incorporated, frankly, overtly classical details. It was a period of classicism that was paralleled also by work of several European architects, including particularly Hoffmann. Now, these works of neoclassicism were carefully excluded from all of the publications of Saarinen's work that appeared later. It was something he, I think, wanted to sweep away. There wasn't much work in Helsinki in the early 20s due to an economic recession. But in 1922, Saarinen alone, and we see his drawing on the left, won the second place in the Chicago Tribune competition. At the time, the prize for both the first, second, and some of the third prize money was the largest cash prize ever awarded in an architectural competition. And here we can see the direction of his work is changing again, perhaps as a result of designing for a city he'd never seen, Chicago. His was easily the most popular entry. People responded very positively to it. It was eliminated in favor of a very formal act of academic historicism by Raymond Hood, and we see that building on the right. So what we see in Saarinen's design is a very skillful composition of phrased setbacks. It's detailed with vaguely medievalizing elements, but these are put together in a very creative way. Hood, by contrast, relies on specific models. His approach to design is academic, even fake flying buttresses at the top. Louis Sullivan was still alive, the first great designer of skyscrapers, and he praised Saarinen's entry as continuing his own hope for a beautiful skyscraper. And in that same article, Saarinen denounced Hood's entry as a less original and really quite disastrous design. Well, once again, Saarinen had prize money in hand. And the correspondence, it's fun to read. When he's awarded the prize money, there is a typical rhetorical invitation. They say, "Oh, dear Mr. Saarinen, why don't you come and visit us in Chicago?" Well, he did. He moved there in 1923, obviously to the surprise of his sponsors. And he did a series of designs without any official client, but was soon asked to teach at the University of Michigan. And there he had the very good fortune to have as one of his students Henry Booth, none other than George Booth's son. And in the spring semester of 1924, Booth, for his student thesis, designed a museum and college of architecture. Now, there's no question in my mind that he chose this topic for his thesis because his parents, in just that year, were beginning to think very seriously about undertaking a similar building campaign on their Cranbrook estate. During the fall of 23, Henry had introduced Saarinen to his father, and the rest, they say, is history. Saarinen, of course, secured the commission for what was essentially an ambitious but very loosely defined program. And during the fall of 1924 and the spring of 1925, Saarinen prepared a series of master plans. We see one of the most developed on the left, and on the right, a model that approximates, a model seen from two views that approximates that plan. The general program was simply a place for artists to work in a sympathetic environment, at least for the art school, which were to be supported by the prep schools, and the prep schools in turn supported by early learning in the grade school. Now, Henry Booth worked for Eero Saarinen after graduating in the office, which soon was set up at Cranbrook, but he didn't have any of the design responsibility he might have expected. After all, his father was paying for this, and he'd done something of this for his student thesis. I think that explains how Henry Booth tossed his father's original drawings around as if they were waste paper. This was when they were still housed in Cranbrook House, before they had all been transferred to an archive. He did it almost with hatred, and I think he never quite got over the fact that he didn't get this or practically any other commissions. He did design some smaller buildings on the side. We wanted to talk to him because we wanted him to tell us what all these things were, and he said, frankly, I cannot remember they all were. They were mainly imagined by Eliel Saarinen. Parts of it, though, were built and remained exactly the same as this master plan. A school for boys, and what we see in profile here are the farm buildings that pre-existed on the site. Academy Way, which was to be lined with faculty housing and the Art Academy itself. And then at the head of a grand cascading fountain, a linked pair of buildings which became the museum and library. These parts were built. We said, well, what's this? Oh, I don't know, maybe a music school. Well, what was this for? Well, there was talk of a landscape school. What was this? Oh, I don't know. He really could not make it out, and I'm not sure Eliel Saarinen knew either, but he was showing the compositional possibilities in this work. Now, as you can see in looking at this, there are several things that are trapezoidal, and the whole thing reflects a very intuitive sense of planning. Axes are not dominant. They lead toward jogs. Squares are not regular. It's an informal sense of planning that relates to theories of Camillo Sitte. Saarinen was a follower of Camillo Sitte. Sitte was an Austrian architect and city planner who had published City Planning According to Artistic Principles in 1893. And this approach, we see Sitte on the left, was the approach he advocated. This was how he showed the votive church in Vienna should be rewoven into the fabric of the city through less formal means, creating some irregular squares about. That was his approach to design. It was the opposite of Beaux-Arts' method, and the opposite, therefore, of what Burnham had proposed for Chicago in 1909. This approach, the academic approach, which Saarinen violently opposed, was meant to isolate great monuments and then have formal settings about. So the overall shapes are somewhat similar, but the approach quite different. Saarinen wrote about Venice as one of his favorite shapes, and Sitte wrote about it as a favorite shape as well. This is a drawing from Sitte of Venice. And here is Burnham's parallel approach to Chicago. Again, one of very formal, organized, isolated elements. Before work on the other parts of the school began, the elder Booth asked Saarinen to adapt those farm buildings for a boys' school. He thought it would be an economical way to achieve that end. Well, in the end, only a tiny, tiny fragment of the original farm buildings was saved, and the rest was knocked down and Saarinen's new building erected. Preservationists would be horrified today if something like that happened. The aerial perspective depicts the loose grouping of component parts of the boys' school: dormitories, classrooms, a dining hall, some laboratories. And this also reflects Saarinen's astounding ability to conceive a building as a totality, a group of buildings as a totality in this case. And those who watched him render this, he did a few pinpricks on the back as guidelines. Those can be seen when you turn the drawing over. And began in the upper right corner, upper left, and began like a machine would do today, to draft the whole thing by gliding back and forth with a Conte crane. I don't know if anyone can match that ability. Now, when we look at the buildings, we see on the right a comparison with James Gamble Rogers' colleges at Yale. In the 1950s and 60s, people called Eliel Saarinen's design an example of Collegiate Gothic. Well, it wasn't at all. This is an example of Collegiate Gothic. Cram and Ferguson's Princeton Graduate College, completed in 1913, where there is a very academic quotation of specific Gothic motifs. Saarinen has modernized that tradition in a sense. He has modernized the academic form in a way of intuitive molding of details which do not have specific precedents. And we can see it in the buildings themselves. When this was published, soon after the school was finished in around 1926, the article in Architectural Record said, "Here is a modern school." Now this too requires a bit of interpretation, because in the 1950s and 60s, even today, it's not regarded as modern. But you can see how abstracted the traditional motifs are in comparison to another example of Collegiate Gothic, James Gamble Rogers Colleges at Yale, built in 1917 to 21. Saarinen, in every way, has modernized tradition. Now, this posed a problem to early historians of modern architecture, and Henry Russell Hitchcock, in what was the first scholarly account of modern architecture in America in the 20th century, came to grips with this by labeling it an example of the new tradition, in contrast to what he called the new pioneers, who were the more avant-garde architects working in Europe at the time. Hitchcock went on to say that the two greatest designers of the new tradition were Eliel Saarinen and Frank Lloyd Wright, the leaders of that group, very much at odds with Le Corbusier. And in a sense, the term new tradition is still, to me, a very usable one. And you can see in the actual buildings Saarinen's skillful reworking of a generically medieval vocabulary. It supports that notion of modernizing tradition, an updating of conventional tradition for 20th century expression. Saarinen's ability to manipulate these forms plastically created beautiful arrangements of mass, varied in profile, in plan, in elevation, with integrated stairs and changes of level. And it was designed and built very much in the manner of a medieval master builder. There were very few drawings done for this. Saarinen had this as his only commission, and it seems he supervised the workers on a daily basis and worked with them to refine details that were not recorded anywhere except in his mind, so that in the gate, the main gate to the boys' school, you can see what appear to be a series of symmetrical arches are actually varied. Every single piece is unlike every other piece. So there's a great sense of life about those elements. Saarinen was very free in his use of generically traded elements. He was fascinated by early Christian architecture because it was a bridge between Gothic on the upper hand and Roman architecture or classical architecture on the other. And several of his buildings in this period draw from this neutral hinge of early Christian architecture. And here we can see it in the dining room with its great vaulted roof. But he also incorporated vaguely classical elements in some of the later refinements, as we see in a part that was finished, I think, around 1927 with panels and arches. It's a mixture of parts, but very well done. And he kept adding to this in the years that followed, so that some of the last components, such as this pergola on the left and a gateway on the right, really reflect an Art Deco mentality. Immediately after the boys' school was built, he began designing other components of Cranbrook, primarily the Academy of Art and faculty housing along Academy Way. And Saarinen's house, seen from the front and the back, stands out in this interlocking composition of forms. And in Saarinen House, we see an example of this early modern architecture that draws very much from precedents in Europe and in Sweden, but for me particularly draws from work by Edward Lutyens, the great English proponent of the arts and crafts. And on the right, we see Lutyens' Deanery Garden, the house, one of his most famous houses in Berkshire, of 1909 to 1910. There's a very similar spirit, even though Saarinen House is smaller, the same elements appear. But more astonishing to me is the similarity of the plans. The grouping of rooms around a courtyard that opens out is identical in both designs, as is the overall proportion and the link to terraced gardens. It's almost too close for comfort. So we still have Saarinen drawing, I think in particular, from English precedents, but again a 20th century interpretation, very much removed from any academic work. He designed the interiors as well, the dining room on the left and a view from the living room toward the studio on the right. He designed not only the furniture, but such elements as the fireplace andirons seen there in the distance. And typical of the arts and crafts and of the new tradition, the andirons are abstracted peacocks, not abstracted geometries as the European modernists would have demanded. And also the interiors are lighter and more open than those at Vitresque. With his next major commission at Cranbrook, he changes gears again in the school for girls known as Kingswood. And in that same authorized monograph by Chris Janer, and you can hear Saarinen speaking over his shoulder, was critical of the boys' school. I think that with each change, Saarinen felt it necessary to apologize for some of his earlier work, though there was no need of that. So Chris Janer wrote, "The design of the boys' school as a whole is not the work of Eliel Saarinen." He was reserved about it. And then now turning to Kingswood. Now Kingswood was announced as a project by George Booth in November 1927, and he reported that designs were already being prepared. Tantalizing hint. Well, what turns out is that it was Henry Booth who had prepared those designs, not Eliel Saarinen. Kingswood was located a distance from the boys' school and the Art Academy, so there was no visual tie. They've searched in vain for drawings of Henry Booth, and maybe he destroyed them in a fit of rage. But one little sketch was found for Kingswood by Henry Booth. It's not very promising. A much better drawing on the right was done by none other than George Booth. Now, whether George Booth did that as a suggestion as to how Saarinen should begin the design of Kingswood, or how he did it to correct or modify a part of Kingswood, is not known. But it's a very interesting reminder that George Booth had architectural training of his own. He apprenticed with his uncle, Henry Langley, who was a highly regarded Toronto architect, and it's no wonder that George Booth was so dedicated to the building of Cranbrook. The approach at Kingwood differs in several ways. Here we see two perspectives, an early one of the entrance court, and on the right, an aerial perspective of the entire complex. There are certain details which show up in several places, such as this very interesting array of stepped chimney. What we have at Kingswood is not a composition of loosely grouped elements, as at the boys' school or academy way. Instead, it's conceived as a single integrated building with a changed vocabulary of architectural detail. It's also different in the way it was recorded as a design. Separate sets of fully detailed design and working drawings were completed by the summer of 1930. The perspective on the left dates from 1929. Clearly by that time, Henry Booth was off the job and Saarinen was on it. In the case of the drawings, everything was worked out in advance. Saarinen did not supervise it to the same degree. He didn't have to. It was clear on the drawings. So we have quite a few changes, as well as a change in vocabulary. The building was completed in time for the first students to enroll in September 1931. And in that first class of graduates was a woman by the name of Floppus Schust, better known today as Florence Knoll. She came to head what was probably the world's leading modern furniture company, I would say, at least from an American viewpoint. The building itself ranges from 1 to 4 in formally massed stories. And here we see an aerial photograph of the complex as completed. This single building is designed with the classrooms and extensions for special rooms and the workshops around one major courtyard with stepped elements that project out, linked by terraces with grand stairs that lead to the lawn. And then the residential component, it was a girls' school, complete prep school. The residential elements for the girls are grouped around a smaller courtyard with an extension out toward the lake. And linking the two along a grand corridor are two major places of assembly, the auditorium and the dining hall, and linking those two were the 4-story element that the girls came to call heaven. It was meant to be a place for parties and the like. Men were not allowed up there, though, during many of the years that the room was still whole. So we have a very interesting composition, but a rather regular one. Now, Saarinen, it seems to me, had the intention of seeking a more American expression with this commission at Cranbrook. And it's now to Frank Lloyd Wright, and specifically to Taliesin, Wright's great country estate begun in 1911, that he turns. And here we have a distant view of Kingswood, and on the right, also across a body of water, a distant view of Taliesin. Saarinen and Wright were in close touch. Here we see the old devil himself on the right, characteristically showing off in his pose with Eliel Saarinen in front of Kingswood. Wright invited Saarinen for a weekend at Taliesin in April 1924. So Taliesin was one of the first buildings that Saarinen saw after going to Chicago, outside of Chicago and Michigan, and the first Frank Lloyd Wright building. And as I mentioned, they remain relatively close, although Wright was always complaining that Eliel Saarinen got much better commissions with much more money, and that at heart he was still a foreign architect, while he, Frank Lloyd Wright, was the true American. But in all honesty, Wright was kinder to Eliel Saarinen than to any other architect I know. Wright hated competition of any sort, and wrote a very moving note on the occasion of Eliel Saarinen's death. Well, it was a natural model for Saarinen. Here we have a view of Kingswood as completed with that telescoping chimney, the four-story element with heaven at the top, and the public areas going off to the left. Now on the right, a similar composition at Taliesin. Taliesin had been described as embodying a new ideal of Midwestern American architecture. It was described as an original architecture devoid of historical styles, with the prevailing tendency of using hipped roofs. These articles all came out long before Eliel Saarinen began his design of Kingswood, and you can sense its appeal, a native expression of American ideals, no sense of historical styles, but only a sense of traditional mass. Lewis Mumford, one of America's leading commentators on architecture, claimed that with Taliesin, Wright has created a true regional form, and he suggested that others should follow his lead. And many major European architects, early modern architects, praised Taliesin as well, J.J.P. Out, H.P. Berlage, and others. So one can sense, I think, very easily how Saarinen was drawn to an interpretation of Taliesin. But just as Saarinen had modernized tradition with the boys' school, so he, in a sense, traditionalized Wright's modern architecture with Kingswood. Here we see two similar elements, an entrance loggia. But in the Saarinen example, windows are traditionally cut through the wall so that the mass of the wall is not interrupted. One has the wall as a primary means of enclosure. At Taliesin, characteristic of Wright, the wall is treated as a screen, and windows are treated as continuous openings. In all these ways, we have a sense of Saarinen making modern architecture at the time more normal and more accessible. This sense of traditionalizing Wright, who was then somewhat more avant-garde than he was in later years, was described, Saarinen's work at Kingswood was described as an exemplification of Saarinen's designing genius. And one can sense the popular appeal at the time. This article, which appeared in 1932 in the Architectural Forum, went on to say, "There has been no effort to achieve a startlingly different or individualistic scheme of architectural design at Kingswood, a fact which may account largely for the undoubted success of the building." In other words, by traditionalizing Wright, Saarinen had succeeded in making aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright popular in a way that Wright never did. Inside these two buildings, Saarinen's building has a series of quite discrete rooms, defined as places with four walls. And Saarinen wrote in his own later book of theory, basically, the room is formed by means of its four walls. He did not question the containment of interior space, whereas Wright, of course, is famous for opening up space into a continuous flow. Again, Saarinen has stepped back from that point of view and approached it more traditionally. I've long been fascinated by the columns of the two parallel examples. On the left, the loggia column of Eliel Saarinen, and on the right, the similar column-like element at Taliesin. Wright tended to abstract and simplify structural elements. Saarinen tended to elaborate them in a more conventional decorative manner. Wright's are rough and simple, treated more as parts of a continuous wall rather than an independent entity. Saarinen's are very elaborately modeled, designed as symmetrical, freestanding elements, almost as pieces of sculpture, a more formal, more traditional approach, more instantly recognized as a column. His columns may, in fact, hold an important key as to how Saarinen came to regard his work. Saarinen wrote of columns, "The Greek column, at its beginning, was hard, clumsy, and unrefined." Perhaps he was thinking of the columns at Taliesin. "But in its construction, in its logic, and in its truthfulness," praise for Wright, "lay hidden its potentialities of refinement." Wright didn't go there. Before the Greek column could be refined, it had to undergo the process of evolution. So I think from Saarinen's point of view, his great accomplishment was to evolve and refine the rougher columns of Wright. Elaborately detailed drawings show how very much attention he gave to every nuance of curve in the column itself. in marked contrast to Wright's looser approach, who would just sketch the column in a rough way. Those columns have a strong telescoping motif, very much like the motif of the chimney. That motif appears everywhere at Kingswood. It was a kind of decorative logo. It's repeated as a decorative motif in leaded glass windows, in carpet designs, and so on. And it must have been in some importance, or at least of note, to Saarinen. In 1934, he and Loya, his wife, dressed up for something called the Crandemonium Ball at Kingswood, or rather at Cranbrook, and they have representations of those column capitals as crowns on their heads. And when Kingswood opened, a lot of people were curious about that column motif. He was asked about it, and he said, "They were done that way because I wanted them so." An easy way out. That's what Lucan would call an artistic fainting spell. In accord with the tradition of the arts and crafts principles, Saarinen advocated collaboration. Thus, the May Queen tapestry in the dining room on the left was designed by Loya Saarinen, who headed the workshop, the weaving workshop at Cranbrook. The furniture in the dining room, auditorium and elsewhere, auditorium on the right, was designed by his son Eero, and even Eero's younger sister Pipson was given a task. She painted her patterns on mezzanine shutters overlooking the dining hall and auditorium, and I don't have a picture of them, it's hard to find. Elsewhere, Loya designed the fabrics and carpets used throughout Kingswood, and Eero designed many pieces of furniture used throughout. Views of the lobby with one of Loya's carpet designs. It's, for me, was interesting to read the rules of Kingswood in the 1930s. It's a reminder of another era within this rather modern setting. The rules were as follows. Each girl, and they were limited one per room, was limited to one reading lamp with permission required for any additional electrical equipment. Girls had to sign out for walking on the grounds in the middle of this park, and they were limited to 1 hour. They were really protected. The telephone, evidently only one, could only be used to speak with family members, but only during 2 specified periods of 15 minutes each. Within those periods, they had to make their call, and then only with permission from the dean of residence. The rules go on. It was a very strictly monitored place. Well, with the next major commission, Eliel Saarinen changes yet again. We see it in the Cranbrook Museum and Library of 1940 to 43. He again traditionalizes modern architecture, but now it's the modern architecture of the international style, or orthodox modernism, that he adapts to a more accessible medium. And probably this last change is due, in large part, to his son Eero Saarinen. Eero was born in Finland in 1910 and was thus a teenager when the family moved to the United States in 1923. He lived at Cranbrook until he went to Paris to study sculpture from 1929 to 30. Then he studied architecture at Yale, graduating in 1934, traveled in Europe during the remainder of 34, then from 35 to 36, worked in the Helsinki office of Jarl Eklund, another of Finland's prominent architects. And one of his early designs, dating from about 1935, is evidently a competition entry. We see it on the left, the so-called Forum Project, and it shows that Saarinen, by 1935, young Eero Saarinen, was becoming very much aware and supportive of a more orthodox, more European modernism, a very sleek, curvilinear form, particularly emulating that by the great Swedish architect Gunnar Asplund. And we see Asplund's Stockholm Exchange building of 1930 with its similar curved glass form. The use of curves might even be called a sort of indication of a northern modernism. Well, with this and other designs in his background, in 1937, Eero returned to the United States and entered into partnership with his father. And almost immediately a change can be detected in the firm's work, as seen in the Klein-Hans Music Hall, 1938 in Buffalo. Instead of the more integrated massing of his father's earlier work with all the parts woven into a single composition, we have a clear expression of functionally articulated parts: chamber hall, concert hall, stage, lobby. It's an expression of function. But the exterior is detailed in a more traditional manner, with framed, paneled elements and a sense of mass. no doubt reflective of Eliel Saarinen's steadying hand. In the slightly later Crow Island School in Winnetka of 1938 to 40, the parts are also sharply articulated, but realized with a sleeker resolution of detail. Work by the Saarinens was beginning to come to the attention of what I call the modernist Harvard design police, led by Walter Gropius and Siegfried Gideon, and clearly Eero was seeking their praise. They were the leaders of newly emerging orthodox modernism in this country. They were critical of this design. They said that pylon is arbitrary, so the design fails. There is an early version of the design in Eero's hand which shows a last vestige of Wrightian influence, a last try with hipped roofs covering the complex. Only one sketch seems to have been done and quickly eliminated. It's realized in a more modern vein with flat roofs and more starkly amplified parts. And that plan of parts with the separated classrooms, auditorium, and so on is a reminder that Eero Saarinen was very impressed by the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius's well-known plan and buildings of Dessau of 1925 to 26, and you can see how the pinwheel plan elements are very similar. Yet there's a traditional quality that's retained. You can see this in the brick framing elements that adorn all the windows, an aspect of Mass that the Harvard design police hated. And the family continued to seek collaborative work. In this instance, it was Eero's wife, Lily Swan, who contributed a series of decorative tiles, my own favorite being this little piggy tile. And that was about the extent of her work anywhere. The third commission goes a step closer, the Tabernacle Church of Christ, just down the road in Columbus, now the first Christian church of 39 to 42. It was, by the way, the first of many commissions in Columbus by the Miller family. In this case, the strictly articulated plan contains the main sanctuary on one side, a chapel at the back, classrooms on the opposite side, linked by a bridge containing offices. And it's derived almost entirely in plan and many of its parts from modern Scandinavian churches, particularly those by Erik Brugman. And we know Saarinen knew them firsthand because he had sketched out their plans and elevations in letters to his dear friend Flappus Schust while he was still in Helsinki. And of course, the Saarinen family, as Flappus Schust, about to become Florence Knoll, moved closer to her great accomplishments, the family had hoped the two might marry, sensing the potential of an extraordinary partnership, which it would have been. But I think probably Florence was no match in looks for the varsity skier Lily Swan. Saarinen made a big mistake, I think. Inside, details such as the light fixtures and the wood screen closely emulate work by Alvar Aalto, probably the greatest Finnish architect of the 20th century. But the Harvard design police found fault with the massiveness of the bell tower, which they found arbitrary, the formal windows, and the textures on the walls of the building, which gave a sense of weight and mass. So clearly, Eliel Saarinen continues to traditionalize orthodox modernism to the degree that the orthodox modernists themselves rejected. That didn't happen with the design Saaro did on his own for the Smithsonian Art Gallery, a competition of 1939. He really realized the full promise of sleek, plainer orthodox modernism. And signaling this accomplishment, it won first prize, with one of the leading members of the jury being no less a figure than Walter Gropius himself. Clearly, Eero finally got the recognition he sought, and yet its modernism, extreme for the time, was the very reason why it was rejected. It simply did not seem to fit on to the pre-World War II mall, and so it was never built. Meanwhile, Eliel Saarinen, and here too, seemingly working mostly alone, was designing the Cranbrook Museum and Library, the two parts connected by this grand open gateway or propylaea. And again, Eliel Saarinen has retained elements of mass, texture, and sculptural ornament. Everything made this building more accessible. It humanized orthodox modernism. And I think, looking back on it, that it truly facilitated a wider acceptance of modern architecture in this country in the early 1940s. The reason I think it's largely by Eliel is not only its looks and its contrast with the Smithsonian model, but from an interview with the architect Ralph Rapson, who was working in the Saarinen office at the time. And he told me that while Eero Saarinen was working on his design for the Smithsonian, Eliel would walk behind his desk so he couldn't be seen by Eero and shake his head no to the other people in the drafting room. And then he'd go to his desk and work alone without Eero on the Cranbrook Museum and Library. But what it does confirm is that without Eero, now Eliel has accepted this sense of a traditionalized modernism. The symmetrical museum and library, in their very symmetry, are at odds with orthodox modernism. And that great classical propylaea is also a bit at odds. There are many precedents for that very distinctive element on the left at Cranbrook, as we see on the right in Eric Asplin's woodland crematorium in Stockholm of 1939. But there had been designs by Joseph Hoffmann and a similar propylaea at the Palais Chaillot at the Paris Exposition of 1937, which Saarinen had visited just before designing Cranbrook. So we have a great many precedents that, again, Saarinen, in a sense, refines. Again, applied textures impart a sense of mass to the walls, as we see looking toward the museum on the left with the propylaea in the center. And around the doorways of the major openings, we see sculptural frames and elements which, again, impart a strong sense of tradition. And if we look at the museum and library at an angle, as we see on the left, I think you can see how very traditional its sense of weight and mass is, compared on the right with the orthodox modernist example by Mies van der Rohe, one of the buildings at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago that Mies designed from 1939 onward. A clear, sleek proposition of form that Eliel Saarinen would never accept. Frank Lloyd Wright had moved on too. Wright continued to add to Taliesin and feature it in publications of his work. It remained current in his mind, but in other work he designed quite different things, most famously, as I know all of you have seen or seen pictures of, at Falling Water of 35 to 37. And here, based partly on his own early precedents, Wright was able to show how visionary architectonic studies of avant-garde European architects could be made into a real building. And I'm comparing it with the Dutch architect Theo van Doesburg's 1933 composition, total visionary, called Space-Time Construction. But it was Wright who knew how that could become real architecture, quite at odds with Eliel Saarinen's work at the time. In his later work, Eliel Saarinen continued to develop his more traditional modernism, as in Christ Church, 1949 in Minneapolis, a paraphrase of the Columbus Church. By contrast, Eero initially pursued the more orthodox modernism of his Smithsonian design, perhaps best seen in the realized components of General Motors Technical Center. The very first design of 44 to 46 was put aside for financial reasons, and when the design was taken up again after 1946, and the buildings completed in 56, Eero, again, according to Rapson, was essentially fully in charge of that modernist essay. But things changed not long after Eliel Saarinen died in 1950. Eero began to question principles of modern architecture. He asked why mass was wrong. He asked why the traditional room needed to always give way to open, undefined continuity. Eero Saarinen wrote, echoing his father almost word for word now, "Today, many of us have come back to much more closed plans, where rooms are really rooms with four walls." Louis Kahn is usually given credit for embarking on this inquiry, but it turns out Eero Saarinen was asking the same questions at almost the same time. And the Irwin Miller House, mentioned earlier this evening, of 1953 to 57 in Columbus, offers an early and important indication of this shift. It was realized with a richer palette of materials than typical of orthodox modernism at the time. It more actively engages with its elegantly landscaped garden. And it reflects also what has become Eero's quest to acknowledge the importance of collaboration. So the elaborate gardens were designed by Dan Kiley, while the interiors were designed largely by Alexander Gerard. And inside, the richness imparted by fabrics, carefully arranged collections and the like, again challenges the purity of orthodox modernism, as do the partitioned rooms that articulate the corners of the otherwise open pavilion. And Craig Miller has suggested that the plan is essentially Palladian in its resolution of 9 elements, according to a regular grid of skylights in the ceiling, another sense of tradition. But I think among the most elegant features of the Miller House are the columns that seem to support light itself. They're beautifully detailed, with a vertical element and an open capital that engages the skylight immediately above and the linear skylights that it connects. This column, to me, now, seems to relate directly back to Eliel Saarinen's column at Kingswood. Both were statements of refined development that helped initiate a more accessible modern architecture of the last half of the 20th century, which Eero Saarinen did so much to promote. By reviving the sense of tradition so inherent in his father's work, Eero really helped give voice to an otherwise obscure abstract language and has helped make modern architecture something we can all read and appreciate today. It was, as Eliel himself, I think, would have approved, an essential step in the evolutionary course of modern architecture. And I want to close with what I think illustrates both columns and both architects' work as they addressed issues of tradition. Eliel Saarinen wrote, "It is an easy task to let one's imagination run wild and to produce such forms as never existed before. The value of art does not depend on one's rich imagination. The value of art depends on how one's rich imagination is mastered." Thank you. He was a European. The design was at odds with the academic image that I think the McCormick wished to put forth as a symbol of the Tribune. It was technically eliminated because Saarinen's entry arrived a day late. But there's a lot behind it that has not been clearly recorded, but that is something that I very much agree with, that it was McCormick and others who found it entirely too modern, even though to our eyes it's not so modern. Booth was not affected by the Depression in any major way. The design of Cranbrook began before the Depression. Kingswood was delayed for a year or two until they raised money. That was from 1927 to 29. The bids came in on budget. It was built with no changes and no compromises. Newspaper magnates tended to prosper during the Depression in ways no one else did. It's true also of the publisher Jones, a cousin of Frank Lloyd Wright, who built his big house, huge house in Tulsa right at the height of the Depression. And he wrote to Wright, "I still have money. I can still build." So it was good business to be in during the Depression. They're all by very distinguished architects, and it's very reassuring to see Cranbrook seeking great examples of architecture when so many schools in a move to economize often don't go that far. The buildings vary a little bit in quality, but they're all challenging, and they're all very sympathetic to the original designs, at least all the ones I have seen. And I think that is very much part of the instruction they receive when they sometimes win a competition or sometimes they're offered a commission outright. Some of the best young talent in this country has been involved, such as Steve Hall. We were talking about that today, and looking back, when I first saw it, I didn't like it. And about a year ago, when I studied pictures and plans, I suddenly realized I liked it very much. Perhaps I've aged. I clearly have aged, but my approach has aged. I'm much happier with that church now. I really think it's a very good building. I'm sorry I didn't make more of it back in that earlier phase. Well, thank you all very much. I've enjoyed being here.